Anytime you're ready, I guess I can see it.
Yep,
Okay.
you're all set.
All right, everyone, I'm going to call to order the meeting of the Bath Charter Township Planning Commission. It's April 13th, 2021. And Nick, roll call.
Yep. So just for anyone who's not familiar with this, the Michigan Open Meetings Act requires that members of any public body that makes decisions in a virtual meeting after April 1st of 2021 just has to say that they are attending remotely and then state that they're, presumably at their home in Bath Township or at their office in East Lansing or whatever. Baker.
Attending virtually, office, Bath Township.
Okay. I'm not going alphabetically. I'm just going in the order of the pictures on my screen. Kramer.
Yep, I am attending virtually and in my home in Bath Township.
Severy.
Attending virtually at my home in Bath Township.
Almarigi.
Attending virtually at my office in East Lansing, Michigan.
Reich.
Attending virtually in my home at Bath Township.
And Fewens Bliss.
Attending virtually at my home in Bath Township.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Has anyone heard from Joel?
I have not.
Okay.
Okay, so we have an agenda. Any changes to the agenda as distributed? If not, is there a motion to approve?
I'll move to approve the agenda.
Second.
Support.
Your support, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
And the motion carries. So now's the time to declare any conflicts of interest, planning commissioners, with any agenda items tonight. Any conflicts of interest? All right, seeing none, let's move on. So we have a first opportunity for general public comment. Would anyone like to address the planning commission on agenda or non-agenda items?
If so, you can raise your physical hand, raise your Zoom hand, or dial *9 if you are dialing in.
Good, not seeing anybody, so let's move on. We have a set of minutes from March 23rd, 2021 to approve. Any additions, changes to those minutes?
Just one comment. My name was left off the agenda.
How
That's it.
dare I? I'm sorry about that, Ray.
I did have a motion the next thing up, so I figured how I could do that since I wasn't there.
All right, so we have an amendment to those minutes. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
So move.
Support.
Support by Ryan. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 And the minutes have been approved. Nick, do you have any communications for us tonight?
I do. So today and continuing into tomorrow, I am virtually attending the Michigan Small Town and Rural Development Conference. That's being hosted by the Community and Economic Development Association of Michigan, along with Rural Partners of Michigan. Today, they had their opening keynote, which just talked about the continuing urban-rural divide and how our nation is sort of at a crossroads of sorts as it relates to that in really any aspect of life, socially, economically, demographically, and so on, and how we need to find ways to come together rather than continuing to pull each other apart. I also attended a session today about housing that I thought was pretty interesting, just talking about some work that's being done up in the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula on trying to improve housing affordability and working with nonprofits and local governments on different methods for doing that. That will continue through tomorrow at noon, and there are a couple of sessions in the morning tomorrow that I'd like to attend. Excuse me. We also have scheduled our next meeting of the whole broadband task force. That's scheduled for next Tuesday, the 20th at 6 p.m., and that will be on Zoom. And lastly, talked with Superintendent Hildebrandt today, and we went through a handful of resumes. So we have some interviews scheduled for an intern that would work under me. So we have some interviews scheduled for Thursday, Friday, and then next Tuesday. So I'm quite excited about that. And I know Superintendent Hildebrandt is excited about that as well, and also eager to help me through my first hiring process of sorts. So I'm excited from that aspect as well, but it'll be nice to have another pair of hands, at least for the summer. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Nick. Any comments or questions for Nick? Okay, so let's move on to old business. So the first item under old business is a public hearing for the Mallory project. So I'm going to open the public hearing at this time. And we have a special use permit and site plan that we could approve, or if there are no concerns, that is, we could approve. But Nick, do you want to lead us into this?
Sure. So as you'll remember from last time, this was a pretty complete application. There had been some discussion about the use of the warehouse part of the structure, and I believe we've resolved that. There really were no significant agency concerns. And we also had a first for me in the staff report on the second page. You'll see I had recommended 3 conditions of approval. The first here is that the applicant has satisfied all 3 of those conditions between the time that the packet went out and now. So from that regard, I would withdraw those recommended conditions of approval. So like I said, this is a pretty complete project. It's very straightforward, and I don't have any outstanding concerns, but the applicant is here, Ron Mallory, and between us, I'm sure we can answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So I just want to give, well, maybe the applicant, I guess, we have heard from the applicant and we've discussed this before, but would the applicant like to say anything at this time? There's no need to. We're going to go to public comment and then commissioner comment and questions too. No, okay. So let's go to public comment if there is any. So let's open it up to anyone that would like to speak or about concerns for this project. Anybody from the public?
If so, you can raise your hand physically if you have your video turned on. Use the raise hand function or dial *9.
All right, I'm not seeing anything. So let's go to commissioner comments and or questions. So commissioners, any concerns or outstanding issues you want to address though? So far, this is going pretty smoothly, I guess, if no one has any comments. And I hesitate to bring it back to the applicant because you got nothing to respond to thus far. Okay, so Nick, let me just go back though to your recommendations. I'm sorry, you said that you're withdrawing all of those recommendations or only a set of them, 1 or 2 of them?
Withdrawing all 3.
Withdrawing all 3, okay.
The applicant has provided a copy of their MDOT permit to myself. The applicant has submitted those drainage calculations and has walked the site with the Assistant County Drain Commissioner, John Morrison. And to my knowledge, there are no outstanding concerns with that.
Okay.
And the third condition was just that they satisfied the other 2 conditions before they pulled building permits. So.
Great. Okay. Okay, commissioners, an additional opportunity here for comments or questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, George.
Thank you, Nick, for going over them with me whenever we did that. I don't remember, but I appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing since there doesn't seem to be any public comment. So at this point, as Nick said, there are no outstanding conditions. We've got no comments or questions. We got a very complete packet here. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the site plan and special use permit if we're ready to do so.
Want one motion for both, Dan, or do you want
I
separate?
think we can do it. I think we can do it at the same time.
I don't think there's an issue with doing it at the same time.
If you'd like to do it separately, we can do that too.
It doesn't matter to me. I would move to approve both the site plan and the special use permit.
Okay,
Second,
and we have support by Ray. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye.
aye.
And opposed, the same sign. All right, it has been approved. Thank you for attending and good luck.
We will work to get this on the board agenda for next week.
Okay, so let's move on to the second item under old business, which is the landscape ordinance. So we do have draft language in our packet. Nick, is there anything you want to say before we get into that?
Yeah, so I have just some outstanding concerns. I know I had sent you all an email on Friday just with some things to think about. I added some preliminary language related to the street trees. Certainly want to have a discussion about that and how in-depth we'd like to get. I also would really love some input on how to handle the often fine line between noxious weeds and native plants that Joel Gutsky had brought up last time. And then also get some input on language related to the ground cover that you would find in section B1. We had talked about, whether the language there worked and satisfied what we were hoping to do. And I still have that highlighted section there just about other possible ground covers that we could include, such as native wildflowers. So, and of course, I do want to point out too that I did add language about an agricultural exemption.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So I have just one question to start maybe. So where in the ordinance, and I could look this up, but I didn't, I'm sorry. So where in the ordinance is this being placed? I asked the question because I don't see any exemption for residential developments, even though I know that we've talked about that several times.
I do remember that now. I thought we had made that clear, but looking at this again, I don't think we did. So I appreciate that. Yeah, this is not intended for single family residential. But this would go under special provisions, Article 15. Other things that would fall under that, if my browser wants to load just a little bit faster. Things that would fall under there are fences, accessory buildings, stating that you have to have access to the street, one building per lot, prohibition of flag lots, language like that. So that's at least where it had been proposed to be placed. If we want that separate or in its own ordinance, then I don't have an issue with that either. But I believe that's just what Ray had recommended at the time.
Okay. And so do you have a thought where you put the residential exemption?
I am thinking I would put it right where the rural exemption is.
Okay. So I guess we want to make sure that we're careful about that. I mean, I think, for street trees, we wouldn't exempt a developer that's building a development, right? I mean, in the street tree, I think requirement would still apply, but the requirements don't apply to individual residential parcels. That's my understanding.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. I completely agree with you. And this is, I guess, maybe a good segue into the conversation about street trees in general. Because, like I said, this is just draft language. I had provided 2 examples of ordinances that I looked at to come up with some of that language. One is from the village of Decatur, Michigan, and the other is from the city of Orange, which I believe is it's either Florida or California, I can tell you that. But it doesn't explicitly state it here, and it was a Google search directly to that document. So, I think if we get too in depth, we're certainly putting ourselves at risk of opening a big can of worms, but I'd love to get more input on this as to specifically whether or not we want to put language about specific approved street tree species, do we want that language in the ordinance, or do we want that as a separate list that's, would be published on the planning and zoning page of the township's website? That's sort of where we can, if it's published on the website, it would be easier for us to amend it if we ran into issues with a particular species of tree. And the way I have it written now is that it would just be in that approved list. So does anybody have any thoughts on that particular issue? I know I saw some nodding. So
I think having it as a separate list is the best way to go. I don't think we should put it in the ordinance itself, because like you said, it'd be awfully hard to change it if it's in there. If it's on a separate list, then we can modify it much more easily.
right, and I'm trying to remember which one it is here.
It's 7G2.
Thank you. Sorry, I was going to say, I was trying to remember which ordinance it was that I looked at. Okay.
Oh,
Excuse me, the Village of Decatur, it would be their second page on the bottom there, section 11. They break down their trees by small, medium, and large. And then that's how they differentiate the spacing between those trees. But they also talk about placement in terms of proximity to buried utility lines, water, sewer, electric, internet, cable, those sorts of things, which I think is a valid thing for us to keep in mind. So I'm not sure how people feel about that. And then also if we want to focus just on, I would think we want to have as many native species of trees as we could, but certainly there are some trees that make sense that are not necessarily native to Michigan.
I looked at the Decatur list of trees, and the thing that concerns me is the list of small trees. A lot of those I don't think are appropriate for street trees. I don't know what their growth habit is, but a lot of those small trees may not get tall enough to meet the requirement of being 14 feet above the street or some distance above the sidewalk.
Yeah.
good for the birds though.
Jason?
So, I mean, speaking of the Decatur ordinance, two things that and they're related. One is section 16 refers to tree topping. That's one of the things that's I think is really important for us to consider. I think of what happens when trees are just topped by utility companies and the trees are destroyed. So if we can add language related to that. But then that got me thinking about ensuring that we make recommendations about trees if there's overhead lines, making recommendations for shorter trees.
Yeah, Jason, that's a good point. Thank you. And this is what I was talking about. You know, I think the more we get into it, the bigger and bigger it could become in terms of a conversation. And so philosophically, how in depth do we really want to get here? I'm not really leaning one way or the other, but there's a lot to think about here.
I would just say that, I mean, if we're going to put this work in, I mean, I think we should put efforts into protecting those trees that result from this ordinance.
I like both of Jason's suggestions there. So I agree that the tree topping, we could have some language in there. And then, you know, the language in this model ordinance on utilities, we could add something there about smaller trees under utilities. Oh, I guess it's kind of there. Yeah.
And on G3A, you reference small species on the approved street tree list. Does that mean we're going to have a breakdown like Decatur has of small, medium, and large?
You know, now that I look at that, I think that was supposed to say medium and large. So I think that may have been where my head was at the time, but I'm open to pursuing whatever route everyone thinks is appropriate.
Yeah, I know you got some information from, I think it was MSU too, about street trees. Most of the ones she had listed there, I don't know what they are. They're not something that's familiar to me. I know she had one that was some kind of a birch tree. Or
Yeah.
a beech, yeah, birch tree, I think, and I'm not sure a beech tree of any kind is appropriate for a street tree unless they've got one that's a single stalk tree.
Yeah, thank you, Ray, for pointing that out. I almost forgot. So I did reach out to a couple of different folks in the Department of Forestry at MSU and heard back from a couple of folks. Included this one email here just because she went into good detail. Professor Doughton had worked, or at least had talked with the forester for the city of Lansing about their trees that they use for parks or for street trees. This is even going a little bit over my head and maybe too in depth because it talks about the the acidity of the soil and soil conditions and things like that. Excuse me, but I was grateful to get a list of specific trees, at least that the city of Lansing uses. But I'm not too familiar with these either.
And I think some of these are native. I mean, red maple, redbud, I'm sure are native. I don't know if some of the other ones are actually native. Maybe river birch, but the ginkgo tree is not native.
Black
A
Kentucky-
river
What's
birch
that?
tree, I don't know if a river birch tree is native or not. We had some of those on our lot when we first moved in here. We had them planted. They are not a street tree.
Yeah, that seems like an odd choice. Jason, did you say something about the street?
Black cherry is a native tree to Michigan. The problem with black cherry is you look at it weird and it will die. It also will just dump a bunch of cherries or bird droppings related to the fruits and stain the sidewalk and street. And so I can't imagine that would be a great street tree.
Did they list black cherry?
Yes.
Yep.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's listed as a park tree.
Oh, I'm
okay,
sorry.
okay.
So sorry, I do want to acknowledge that George has had his hand up.
Yep, sorry, George.
I was gonna say, I have some notes. Everybody's pretty much covered everything on my notes, but I know on when you discussed the utilities on this Cantor section 15. Also, because we've had rentals in town where we've had trouble getting trees removed that were actually planted by the city. They're over our drain, and then we can't get them removed because they're a public tree, but yet the roots are going into the drain. So how do you fight that? Keep that in mind. And then also some of these trees I see on the list that we talked about, like the cherry that has the debris. We also want to keep in mind our drainage on the roads, like in front of the cemetery where we have the drains, we have to clean them out on a regular basis. That debris, how we're going to manage that without any extra maintenance.
Right. So just, I want to draw everyone's attention to the first page of the Village of Decatur's ordinance under definitions. They talk about park trees and street trees. Of course, the street trees being those that would be along the sides of the streets. And then park trees are just those in parks or other open spaces that are owned by the municipality. And the cherry trees, I think, based on that email I had gotten, they do have that listed as a park tree. So,
Well, the Kentucky, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead, George.
Like the Kentucky coffee tree, there's one of those, if you want to ever see one on Nichols Road, as you go down to the theater where the old farm used to be on the east side of the road on that curve. Just south of Coleman Road, there's a curve right there, and there used to be a farm. There's a big Kentucky coffee tree right there. But they have a lot of debris and sprouts come up from the bottom of them too. They got seed, like a seed pod, a coffee pod. That's probably why they're called coffee tree. They have like coffee beans. They're awesome trees.
yeah, I like how they look too, but they certainly do make a mess.
My recommendation is not to get too into the weeds here on the tree species. I mean, I think it's a good idea to put any list that we have, whether it's native species, park trees, or street trees, as a separate item. And then we should spend some time, though. Someone should spend some time in developing that list. But I think we're probably not going to be able to do a very good job of that here.
I have a couple of other contacts for that, so I'm happy to reach out to them. But I agree. I think keeping it as a separate list makes sense. That was my recommendation. And I'm content sticking with that if everyone else is comfortable with it.
Okay.
I am. I also have a quick question because I know a couple of you guys are pretty knowledgeable about the trees apparently. Are there any like dwarf mixes or anything that are like would be considered a native tree? Because I know nowadays you can get a dwarf tree that's not, that's controllable. More or less. I don't know if you guys know much about if they do have native species of them, probably.
My understanding is that you can have a native species that's kind of a dwarf species as well. But,
Okay.
and others want to weigh in. Is that wrong? Anybody? No, I think that's right. I mean, I've looked at some of these myself. So yeah, I don't think there's a problem.
I think that separate. I was going to say, I think that separate list is a good idea because then it would be easier to do a case by case, control of it.
Yeah.
Right. And then if we, are experimenting with some species, we don't have to worry about amending the ordinance multiple times a year just to change a tree species.
Yep.
Go back to my list of outstanding concerns or areas for discussion.
I would like to hit that item under B1. So this, so this is the unpaved portions planted with grass, ground cover, shrubbery, or other suitable live plant material.
Before we leave the street trees, I got one comment on street trees.
Good,
G2B says that residential properties are encouraged to plant street trees as appropriate. I don't think that should be encouraged. I think they should be required. Any residential development, they've got to put street trees in.
Yeah.
Not single family homes.
Right.
Somebody's going to build one house, but if a developer's coming in to put in a subdivision with single family homes, they should be required to plant street trees.
So I guess just that whole section in general, G2, because G2A talks about, requiring it within development and high density development, and then encouraging it within the low density, medium density, and high density residential. Do others have thoughts on that?
Other than how many are we going to require if we require it? Every
Right, and
house is a little excessive.
Yeah, and I didn't get into the specifics of how many or how far apart and that sort of thing yet. I figured that would be in there. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say item B there, we do have non-residential uses in low density and medium density, right? We just expanded office uses in those two districts, if I'm remembering correctly. So I wouldn't limit it to just residential developments. I think anything that comes before us as a site plan, it should apply.
I agree.
A single family home is not going to come to us for a site plan, obviously, right? But all larger residential developments will come to us as a site plan. All commercial developed projects will come as a site plan. I think all of those things, all of those entities, this should apply to.
Can I, can I poke John? I feel like you've been really quiet and I'd like to hear what you're thinking.
Oh, I'm just thinking about the incompatibility of street trees and sidewalks. Because we have sidewalk damage from trees that are planted in between the road right of way and the sidewalk. And we've also required utilities to be put in some of those areas. It doesn't seem to me like this is a very compatible thing to require, considering the future use of the property that they're going to be planted in. I'm not a big proponent of street trees, quite honestly.
One comment on street trees and how for a new development, especially where there's nothing there now except maybe a street. One thing we've done in another location is to put like water mains and things like that, a water main specifically under the sidewalk instead of in the grass area between the curb and the sidewalk. Because that way, if you got a water main break, you can rip up sidewalk and it's not that expensive. But if you have the water main underneath the trees, and you have to take out a 12-inch tree, that's not that inexpensive to do that. So I think where we locate the utilities in relation to the street trees makes a difference also.
Yeah, I would agree with you,
I
Ray.
agree.
Sidewalks that are on private property. So now you're really going to get into a new with the maintenance of the utility, aren't you?
Well, if sidewalks are on private property, then the township has to have an easement for those sidewalks. They can't be on private property and not become public. So there has to be an easement for that.
Trying to make sure I take good notes. Ray, are you saying that was just for water lines or was that for other utilities as well?
It could be for anything. Normally, your electric lines are going to be outside the right of way in new developments. I mean, where I live right now, the underground utilities, electric, phone, cable, those are all on private property in an easement. So street trees wouldn't impact those at all. So really, and the sewer is normally in the middle of the street, the storm sewer and the sanitary sewer. So water main is the one thing that's kind of doesn't have a fixed place in some places. And so I know if you can put that under the sidewalk.
Okay.
You want to plant a street tree over a sewer lateral though either, Ray.
Oh, no, you wouldn't want to. That's true. But the problem is when you are developing something like this, you don't necessarily know where the lateral is going to go. But you don't want to put it under that. And the other problem with street trees, and I know some of these ones I read that Nick gave us, talks about the street trees cannot block streetlights, which is true. But if you drive down the street, you see that all the time. But I think with some planning ahead with a new subdivision plat, they can take that into consideration.
Yeah, I agree. And there's already language about the lateral lines, water lines, sewer lines, electrical lines in the ordinance.
I would just tweak that to make sure it's clear that, really any of those trees that would apply for, not just the small species, because that language is word for word out of the Decatur ordinance.
Yeah. The other comment I have on street trees is on G4C. Is that the trees have to be at least 7 feet above the surface of any sidewalk? I think that's too low.
Okay.
The other ordinances I saw here said 10 feet. 10 feet may be higher than we need, but if somebody's riding a bicycle down a sidewalk and they stick their hand up, 7 feet is going to whack them. I think it ought to be 9 feet or 10 feet. And the 14 feet above the surface of the road may be okay. The other ordinances that we had, that you gave us, Nick, I think said 15 or 16. The other comment on types of street trees, I don't know if the county road commission would, I think they might want to have some say in that because these street trees are going to be in their right of way.
Yeah.
And I know that Ingham County has a list, at least my understanding is they have a list of, Ingham County has a list of trees that are approved for street trees.
John?
They've been very adamant that the road commission's not responsible for trees along the road.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're not responsible for them, but generally when you put something in the right of way, you have to get a permit from the road commission. Maybe you wouldn't for street trees, but.
George?
Just a quick comment. Also, the trees also create, if they're over the blacktop or, roadway, they do actually cause the road to dry out slower. So it does, shorten the life of your roads.
Good point, George. You're right.
Very good point, George.
Stay a good instructor.
All right. I mean, so for street trees, I mean, I guess we should just kind of take the temperature here of what we're thinking. I still want street trees to be in the ordinance. I mean, I recognize the problems here that people have pointed out, but the benefits are immense in terms of property values and economic values for street trees and trees in general around private property and commercial properties.
I have a couple of outstanding things I just wanted to get a feel for how everyone feels about. Section 17 of the Decatur ordinance has this whole long section about removal of trees and replacement. If the tree is dead or diseased. To me, it would feel like a no-brainer if you have a street tree and it's diseased, you would want to remove it. But do we want to include language on that? And I guess on that same note, do we want to include language about removal of stumps within a certain distance of the road? Because this talks about street trees and park trees, stumps being removed to below the surface of the ground.
I guess the other question is if there's a street tree in front of your house and it dies, who's responsible for replacing it?
Well, the road commission is going to tell you it's the property owner.
Yep.
I think the township would probably tell you it's the property owner. They may not like that. That certainly comes into issues with trees that would fall within that distance that, were clearly there before this ordinance was adopted. And properties being legacied, or I try not to use the term grandfathered. So that's what I mean by legacied. But trees that were there before this ordinance was adopted, do they have to comply with this?
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, and most of the residential developments going forward are likely to have homeowners associations affiliated with those developments, right? So typically a homeowners association would pick up the cost of placing street trees.
I hope we wouldn't require them to replace it with the same height. Should I say I got a 10-year-old tree and then we have to replace it with a tree of that size? Would be very.
I think that would be unreasonable.
Right.
Yes.
Especially when, it becomes cost prohibitive.
One of the ordinances that you gave us, and I can't remember which one it was, Nick, actually had something that addressed that. Depending on the size of the tree that came out, you had to put a certain thing back in.
My guess is that's probably the city of Orange. I'm almost certain that was Orange, California.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessary in our case.
No, I think that's
I don't think so.
excessive.
All right, anything more on street trees before we move to other sections of this ordinance? Nick, do you feel like you've got enough to make some changes and bring it back?
I'll definitely have a lot to think about. Yeah, I think I do. I'll reach out to a couple of you individually outside of this meeting just to pick your brain a little bit more.
Okay.
I know most of our meetings have been very long, so I don't want to sit here and dive into the minutia, for 2 hours.
The one thing in a Decatur ordinance, they talked about removal of unsafe trees. And I know that's a problem because there are unsafe trees sometimes in the right of way and sometimes on private property. I guess the question is, do we want to address that at all?
But we do have a section on the maintenance of street trees. I would assume that maintenance means the removal of diseased trees, removal of dead parts of trees. But we could make that explicit in that section. I would say you should add the removal of diseased parts, all of trees, and then replanting of trees also. We are going to have to think about, who's responsible for that. But again, like I said, I think majority of residential developments are going to have some sort of a homeowners association. It seems reasonable to me that that kind of group would pick up the costs.
Well, and then one other question that does come up here, and I think it's in both example ordinances that I provided, Both of these communities basically say that you can't take these trees out without permission. Personally, I don't know why somebody would want to take out a healthy tree unless they needed to for maintenance purposes.
Or aesthetics. You have your own trees in your own yard that, you have your own kind of plan, and then you have a street tree that's kind of sitting right in front of the tree you want to grow. And I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there.
Right.
There are people who don't like to clean up the leaves.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think, depending on the context of where you're at within the township, it may or may not make sense to do that. And then sort of along that same note, this Decatur ordinance designates somebody as village forester. It includes a municipal civil infraction for violation of this in terms of not replanting a tree that's been removed, or removing or destroying a tree without, permission, that sort of thing. Do we want to go that far?
Nope. I don't want to go that far.
I wouldn't think so either. It's a good point though about, typically this is part of a site plan, right? The landscaping plan will be part of the site plan, and you have to sort of abide by the site plan indefinitely, right? So code compliance, or I guess I don't know how you enforce that, but if 6 trees are missing, which were there in the site plan, that does seem to be a problem, something that we could enforce in a different sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would come under a site plan violation.
Right.
So I think that would cover it.
Jason?
Should there be consideration for low or high allergen trees and some accommodation for that? Whether that's in the township websites of approved trees or somewhere else?
If I can jump in right there, there is a gentleman, he lives on the West Coast, but he's done a very extensive amount of research on this in terms of which trees are good and bad for allergies, in terms of pollen and other things. I'll send that link to everyone if they're curious to look at it, but that's certainly something I would keep in mind. And that kind of goes back to when I had mentioned a while back that article about male versus female trees and that sort of thing. And I think we do need to think about finding a balance there as well, so that we don't, have too much pollen or, a ton of fruit from these trees dumping all over the place.
That's where that separate list will be nice.
The other thing is we don't want a developer to come in and plant all the same kind of trees either. We don't want another ash tree problem where something comes in and kills them all.
That is true. And so, yeah, we don't have anything in here in diversity, do we, of street trees? I think we should consider that. That's a great point.
All right, I think I have plenty to work on with the street trees, so I'm content going to that. I'm trying to remember where it was.
The B section, general site requirements.
Cover.
Yep. Yeah, so there was I guess there was a question, you raised it again, Nick, when you introduced this about, I think you were referring to Joel's comment about most of the grass species not being native species. So this requirement of 75% native species, I just want to make sure we all have a similar understanding about what we expect there. So if you've got a list of 10 species that you're using in a development, 7.5 of those species are going to be native, regardless of the quantity of each of the species that they're using. Is that what we had in mind? Or are we talking in terms of numbers, absolute numbers?
I would think numbers rather than number of of species, but that's my take on it.
So that works pretty easily for shrubs and trees and that sort of thing. But of course, it doesn't work for turf grass.
Well, and I think we talked about that extensively last time, that the turf grass or other ground cover wouldn't be counted as part of the landscaping. I don't consider it landscaping.
Well, it's in our landscaping ordinance here.
Well, we can provide clarification that that's.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's fine. So maybe the requirement for native species, I guess we're restricting to trees and shrubs. Is that right?
I would think so.
I mean, I would like to have it go further, but I guess I'm unsure of how to do that without getting into this kind of debate about turf grass and, you know, native wildflowers. Like, I like your point there, Nick, and we should try to encourage that sort of thing.
Sorry, I think it was Jason who had brought up the point about most grass species not being native to Michigan. Jason, had you mentioned any last time that were? I can't remember.
Yeah, there's all sorts that are native. They don't make great turf in the way that we think about a lawn. But they're way more beautiful and more practical and friendlier to native insect species.
Yeah. I mean, one idea is to restrict the use of turf grass, some percentage, right? Rather than, and to have a separate part of the ordinance. So not subject to the native species, but restricting the amount of turf grass, non-native turf grass.
Are we thinking like 10%, no more than 10% of the property?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking something like that, yeah.
I can buy into that. Ray, how about you?
What would that mean? I mean, if you take a look at a normal subdivision, half the lot is or more is turf grass. Are we telling
we're not
people they
talking
can't
about-
do that anymore?
We're not talking about private lots, I don't think. Right, we're still talking about, I believe, when it's applied to residential development, we're talking about the,
Like common open spaces.
yeah, the open spaces or the sort of public areas, boulevards, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think we need to make that clear. If that's what we're talking about.
Well, we're going to include an exemption, right, for individual residential lots. So none of this applies to residential lots, including the native species thing, even though, quite frankly, I'd like to have that apply to residential lots.
So really, the only thing that applies to residential is going to be the street trees.
So far,
Is that correct? Okay.
so all right. So where are we at? Let's look at number one then. So we've got. I guess anybody want to weigh in on ground cover? Whether you think we ought to restrict non-native turf grass in some areas, if that's feasible, reasonable, or you think we're getting in trouble doing something like that?
I don't know enough about it, to be
Yeah.
honest with you.
I would just say that, the non-native turf grass is usually the playground areas or other recreational areas that are low maintenance. And so while I would love to restrict it as much as possible, I do recognize the value of those spaces for children and families.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So let me ask this sort of on the flip side of the scale. Talking about ground cover, things like rocks or stones, not to pick on a specific example, but, right here around Chandler Crossing, a lot of the medians and the landscaping is largely stone and rocks. Personally, I don't think it looks good, but, do we want to find a way to limit that type of thing going forward? And if so, how do we do that?
Yeah, I would think you'd want to. I mean, like Jason said, there's a lot of non-native ground or native ground covers, right? They do require a little bit more effort when you get them started, but most of them require far less maintenance once they're started. And again, we're not talking about individual residential lots here. All right, so I guess Nick, right, you've got notes you're taking, but I think we need to revisit this and maybe find some other examples. But I think we could entertain the idea of limiting turf grass with some of the exceptions that we talked about, including for play areas and that sort of thing.
One thing, somebody who knows more about this than I do, on ground covers, because I got a little bit of ground cover here. It looks great in the summer, but in the winter it dies off to nothing. And then it comes back up in the spring. So you're going to have several months out of the year that it's not going to look all that great.
I don't know that that's much different from anything else, really, to be honest. Winter can be fairly bleak. It's all gray and brown and white.
That's why we need snow.
Jason, were you going to say something?
I wanted to emphasize Nick's question about landscaping for parking lots and the overuse of gobs of stone in median spaces, or whatever they're called, and how we want to limit that as much as possible. And if I remember correctly, I remember Ray, when we were talking about past development, talking about how, though maybe it was you, Dan, talking about how, those stone areas are prone to killing whatever trees are planted in there.
Yeah, I would support that kind of restriction too.
Can look into some language on that.
All right, George?
We also look into some type of invasive species list of grasses, because there are a lot of grasses nowadays that you can just go buy online that are actually invasive to Michigan and can devastate a large area. So, even little areas or cause damage in other ways. So,
okay, so
maybe we should look at some type. I'm pretty sure probably it's available all over the place.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think most people would agree. Some sort of list of prohibited species.
Okay, so just moving down, the percent native species. So maybe we need to clarify that that's trees and shrubs, possibly, at least to start. And then, but this is total number of species number of individual plants rather than species number.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry, I had a thought and it's gone. So
the thing that I'm struggling with this landscaping ordinance, and it's the thing that's unsaid here, is that, this is all for public benefit, right? In my mind, right? These are public benefits, public goods that private developers we're asking them to pick up the costs. And I think that's not unreasonable, but it has to be said that, this is kind of what we're doing here. We're providing a public good, a public benefit. It's not just sort of satisfying some curiosity that we have, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that this kind of thing brings a lot of value to communities. John?
I think we should be careful, Dan, if that's our objective, to make sure that we don't require something that requires a lot of herbicides or pesticides or irrigation to maintain.
I absolutely agree with that. Yeah. I mean, but that typically is non-native turf grass, right? I mean,
that's correct. Yes.
That's the number one sort of demand for that sort of thing. That's why I think we ought to limit it or think about creatively limiting non-native turf grass.
Well, we also got to realize that a lot of those grasses go dormant when there's high temperatures and minimal water. And then they come back again later in the year.
Yeah.
to address Ray's issue, that's just the way some of those plants grow. That's how they survive.
But the maintenance, not only the application of herbicides and water, but just the mowing and the cutting and all of that, right? That's another issue here. So if we can minimize that sort of maintenance, I think we'd be all better off, and it make it easier on the owner too.
I would agree.
All right, anything additional that we want to talk about with the landscape ordinance? I think we've got this. And Nick, if you want to reach out to a few people and as you're kind of tweaking this a little bit, please do so.
Just a comment, I guess. I think we've had good discussion here, but I think Nick, you did a really good job of putting together the basic document. When
You
I read
did.
through it, I thought this sounds really, in general, really pretty good.
And thank you,
I
Ray.
agree.
I know you worked on it as well. I just sort of jumped on from where you had started, but at least as a starting point, I was happy with where the street tree language was without getting any other sets of eyes on it. So I have a really good set of notes here, and I appreciate all this input. And I'll definitely reach out to a few of you individually to get some more thoughts or ask about specific language that I'm looking at putting in there.
Jason, do you have a comment?
More of a wondering, I'm not sure how municipal property, whether that's exempt from zoning ordinances. I'm wondering if there's a possibility of including municipal property within this.
That's a good question. I don't really see any reason why it would be exempt. The Decatur ordinance talks about parks and other, in their case, village-owned properties. So I would think it would be included.
Yeah, I would encourage that too. So if it's not implied, then maybe it needs to be explicit.
Yeah, I can do that as well. We do have Joel here now. Joel, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but before we do that, I think we should probably have you state that you're attending remotely and just say that looks like you're probably at home from Bath Township.
I am. I'm in my home in Bath Township, attending remotely. Sorry about that. I had a little wow issue, for lack of a better term.
We've all been there at some point.
Yeah.
So Joel, I know, unfortunately, I think you missed most of the conversation here, but we talked about the street trees quite elaborately, but then we also talked about ground cover.
I actually heard it, Nick. I was
Oh,
on the phone, but I was muted and I couldn't unmute myself on the phone. So I was on for all of about maybe 10 minutes. I missed the last 10 minutes.
Okay. Did you have any outstanding thoughts?
Nope.
No? Okay, great.
I'm good.
I probably will give you a call just to ask you about this fine line between noxious weeds and native species, but
Okay,
we can do that outside the meeting.
sure.
Okay, so then let's move to the architectural design and site plan revisions. Again, we've got some draft language here. And I guess either Nick, and I know Ray, you worked on this too. Do you want to just kind of give us a summary about what you're intending this to do?
Yeah, sorry, just 1 second. I want to finish writing down
Sure.
my last thought. So this language from the last time you've seen it has not changed. That's good. I was kind of expecting a collective groan, but that didn't happen. So what I did is reached out to Township Legal Counsel because I had a conversation with Ray and also with Dan about this, about some of the more specific requirements related to facades that we were looking at. And I guess the gist of the feedback that we got from legal counsel is that any sort of regulation that we would put on the facade, at least based on precedent from the Michigan Supreme Court, is that the justification for that language would have to go beyond just aesthetics. Legal counsel stressed that there had been communities in our state that had attempted to justify specific facade-related architectural standards on aesthetics alone, and the state Supreme Court shot that down. I personally think that if that had gone to the US Supreme Court, it probably would have been reversed, but that's my take just based on what I've read. But of course, we don't ever want to have to deal with that. So I think it is important, and I think fairly simple, that we can think about some justifications beyond aesthetics for some of these requirements. Some examples that legal counsel had pointed out were things like enhanced walkability. Trying to recall some of the others. I guess that's a good starting point. I'll see if I can pull up that email and see what the ideas were.
But as of now, there are no standards in this, right? I mean, this is mainly a reporting requirement, right? As part of the site plan, that they ought to include various things related to the architectural design and materials, but there's no requirement for anything in here, the way that I read that.
Right. Well, and to go back to some of the specifics that we had talked about, I know we had talked about glass along streetscapes that had sidewalks. Sorry, I'm digging through old notes here. We had talked about trying to prevent what's effectively called a blank wall, encouraging some sort of interesting design of that facade with some sort of secondary material.
Yeah, so you have, varied relief on those walls, right? You're not having one flat wall. I mean,
Right.
So some of these things, so I guess I see this as some of these things we could be creative, I think, and figure out health and welfare, safety rationale to support the design requirements, right? The alternative, which I like quite well too, is that we develop a really detailed and quite good set of guidelines that are not part of the ordinance, but it's something that we give a developer when they're coming in and say, these are our architectural design guidelines. They are not enforceable in the same sense, but they are strongly encouraged. And then we get around any of these legal problems of mandating standards, right, that are based on aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And it provides a lot of flexibility, obviously, to the developer. And we can be as detailed and as extensive as we want in laying out those guidelines. So that's one thing we could do. Or we could do a hybrid approach where we can, if there are things that we know that we want, that we can easily justify in terms of health and safety, welfare, we include those in the ordinance, and anything else that we think maybe leans more towards aesthetics, we include in sort of a guidelines document.
Yeah, I would agree with you totally, Dan. And we've also got one phrase that we can use anytime, and that's that it must be harmonious with existing development. And that's pretty open gate as to what constitutes harmonious.
Yeah, I agree. I do worry that that doesn't get us moving in the right direction. It basically makes sure we're not sliding back.
Right.
Right? Because, I think we want some of our buildings to look not like the buildings that we have, right? We want a higher standard. And so we got to get it going somehow before we can lay into that sort of harmonious language in maintaining a high standard rather than maintaining a current standard.
Thank you for not pointing out specific buildings.
Well, once we get some guidelines that kind of nudge developers in that direction, then we can keep raising the bar incrementally, though, relatively easily.
That's right. I think that's right. And I shared with Nick, and I don't know if I could, some example of some guidelines that was really extensive. And, it's probably beyond what we want to do, but there were a lot of ideas there. And I think there are, such things as sort of architectural best practices for commercial buildings, right? To make them interesting. So I don't think it's unreasonable. You're still providing a lot of flexibility. So we wouldn't be dictating, I don't think, specific materials, but we might be dictating among a large set of materials that some proportion of the development, for siding, for example, would have to be a high quality material, right? But I'd be interested to know what you all think about this sort of guidelines as separate from the ordinance.
I think guidelines are a very good idea, Dan, because it gives us an evolving direction that we can go in as things change without having to rewrite the whole ordinance.
One specific thing that I had asked both Ray and Dan for their opinion on, and that I still think is a really good idea, that isn't necessarily an architectural standard, but is more of a site plan layout standard, would be encouraging and or requiring that parking within the high density development zoning district and the downtown development authority area, parking in those areas be in the rear of the building. Justification for that would be promoting walkability and having buildings closer to the street. And certainly aesthetics is part of that as well, but be curious what others think of that.
I think that's a good idea.
To me, it seems like a no-brainer, but I certainly want to hear what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, the key thing is, I like that idea, but then we still have to leave enough room on the street side for some landscaping, so that we don't have paved street, paved sidewalk, and then a building with no place for any greenery or anything else.
Would you want to mandate that would always be between the building and the sidewalk, or would that be something that could fall within a tree lawn that'd be between the sidewalk and the curb?
Yeah, it could be any place, I think, between the building and the road. We need some greenery in there somewhere.
Okay, I just was curious.
I personally would be hesitant to mandate that all parking be in every situation behind the building. And I would think it would depend on the market you're trying to reach and the site that you're trying to develop.
Well, we could certainly have language that says it's strongly encouraged, not necessarily required.
Yeah, I like the basic idea too, Nick. I mean, I do think this sort of being able to nudge applicants, rather than mandates is probably a good idea. Just be clear about what we prefer. And then, as John said, if circumstances don't allow it or it doesn't seem reasonable, that we have the flexibility in the ordinance to back off that.
Mm-hmm. And that could be within the guidelines as well, rather than in the language of the ordinance.
Yeah. So all that said, I mean, what you have here is still, I think, something that we should do, right? I mean, all of these requirements as part of the site plan, I think we want to encourage.
Yeah, so like I said, the language that you're looking at here hasn't changed since the last time you saw it. And this is, mostly Ray's doing in terms of what information should be provided to the Planning Commission in the site plan details, what's it called, the materials board that shows their different materials, detailing the color of it and that sort of thing. I think that all makes sense. I'd really like to take a crack at cleaning this up and making it a little bit more readable. But that's certainly not urgent for me. I'm content with going forward with what we're already talking about and then going back later. But I think there's some language in here that's a bit dated. For example, 15 copies. I've only had one instance since I've been here where I've required them to give me 15 copies.
I don't think it's necessary anymore.
No, I really don't think it is. It used to be obviously that you'd have a physical copy delivered to each of those reviewing agencies, and then each of the planning commissioners would get a copy, and there'd be a copy kept by the planning department, and that would, in theory, come out to 15 copies. But given that most plan review is done digitally now, some flexibility there I think makes sense.
So Nick, then, okay, you can clean this up. I mean, I would like to, when this comes back to us, let's let's put an example of some architectural guidelines in the packet, just so people have a sense for what other people are doing. I sent you one, I can look for some others. And just kind of have this conversation about how far we want to go. Again, they're guidelines, right? And so we ought to agree that these basic guidelines are something that we support, knowing that we can't enforce them in the same way that we could if they're in the ordinance. But then, you can include pictures and drawings, and you can get quite detailed. And I think that might be appreciated by a developer. When they have their packet, when they're first contacting us, and then those guidelines. And I think that would be a benefit both to us and them.
Right.
Any additional comments or questions on this before we leave it? Okay, thanks, Nick and Ray, for looking into this. All right, so we have no new business, then let's skip to report from planner. Nick, do you have something additional to cover?
I do. So just one thing, well, actually I have 4 things, sorry. So to start off, renovations continue in the back part of the office, where my office is, and then where the assessor's office will be moving once those renovations are done. So I've been working from home a decent amount. I've been trying to be in the office more, but between those renovations, making it difficult to be on the phone and concentrate. But then also, unfortunately, a couple of employees having tested positive for COVID, it's made my paranoia go up a little bit more. So I've been working from home, but anytime anyone needs to meet with me in the office or out in the parking lot or wherever, I'm happy to do so. We should be seeing at our next meeting Sunrise Forest coming back for a site plan amendment. I've mentioned this to a few of you. They have identified an additional tenant in that building. As you know, the approved site plan right now is the vertically integrated medical marijuana, and then also that coffee shop. It's my understanding they have an agreement with a, why am I blanking on a diner? Thank you, I'm blanking on my word. A diner that should be going in there as well. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've seen some of the renderings. They've also hired a new architect that's sort of upped the game of the design of the building. And I think it looks even nicer than it did before. So that should be coming back next time. I'm just waiting on a couple more pieces of information from them. The Marsh Point townhouses that we saw last time, was hoping to have that on the agenda this evening as well. But once I got back the comments from the township engineer, it was an extensive list of comments and concerns. So that information's been given back to the applicant. His engineer is working on that, and they are also hoping to be at our next meeting. But we'll see how that shakes out. Lastly, 2 things related to Noka Lofts. They have submitted an amended site plan requesting a major site plan amendment for the existing Noka Lofts site. They want to install carports. I believe it's 110 carports. I am just finishing up a memo to them with some of the outstanding issues on that property after having conversations with a few of you, as well as Superintendent Hildebrandt and Bert Gale, our zoning administrator. And so, I'll say this again, but, this would be the first time I'll say that I would formally recommend that the Planning Commission not entertain any site plan amendment until the property comes into compliance with the current site plan, because there are a handful of issues there. So we'll see what they have to say once they get that memo. Additionally, they have also submitted a revised proposal for what they had previously called Noka Lofts North, which is that vacant property next to it. That will be sent out for agency review tomorrow morning. I suspect that some of those same concerns that the agency reviews brought up previously may come up again, but we'll see what they have to say, and we'll go from there. I believe that is it. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Nick. That was a lot. So any questions or comments for Nick? If possible, Nick, it'd be nice to maybe discuss the architectural standards in the same night that we see the Sunrise Forest stuff.
I'll see what I can do.
Or at least, just distribute those guidelines. I think that they're actually doing a lot of the things that I would have in mind in their new renderings and their new architect that I think is kind of a high quality commercial design. So.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think I may have misunderstood or misheard you. So you're saying the same night that Sunrise Forest comes back?
Yeah, if part of that is beyond just if they're going to be showing us the new renderings and elevations, it'd be nice to see an example of what I think is a fairly high quality architectural design, and we can have that discussion then separately about the architectural guidelines.
Okay, understood. Yeah, I don't think that'll be an issue, so long as I get the information from the applicant in time. It should be able to be on the next agenda.
Yep. Okay. Okay, we have no, we have no public, I think. Yep, no public. So Ryan, do you have a report as a trustee?
I do. We met last week and took a few actions that you all might care about. We had 2 more committee appointments, one to the Construction Board of Appeals, Michael Piper, and Les Hayden to Parks and Rec. We have reworked the process for getting our own agenda to be created. I think it'll free up time and space for us not to make amendments at the beginning of the meeting. Not that that will never happen, but I think it should be a little bit smoother now. We did pass the first reading for both ordinances, the marijuana ordinances 3168 and 3169. It took a couple votes on one of them, but we finally got there. We agreed to a resolution, or we were introduced to resolution, isn't that right, Nick, for the outdoor dining piece? And I understand that that may or may not come before this group at some point to help restaurants who want to do outdoor dining be able to do so, especially with some of the regulations coming out of DHHS for the pandemic. So I'm excited to see where we go with that. And then finally, the storage rental SUP that we've been working on together moved forward and was approved by the board. So that has been processed and is on its way. And that's about it. We meet again next week.
All right, thanks, Ryan.
If I can piggyback off of that real quickly, just to talk about this outdoor dining resolution. So Ryan's absolutely correct. It was introduced and should be voted on next week. We had been approached by a restaurant in the township that wanted to have some outdoor seating. I had a conversation with Dan very briefly, but also had a conversation with Superintendent Hildebrandt and also Bert Gale. And, we determined that, we don't have any ordinance language about this, and that just to ensure that the township doesn't put itself in a bad position, creating a policy, basically ensuring that anyone who does this would be agreeing to comply with the building code, the fire code, and regulations from the state Liquor Control Commission was a good idea. So the resolution that Ryan referred to is essentially stating that the planning department will create this policy and publish it on the website. I'm almost done with that language. And since this is temporary seating and the policy, the way it was recommended, will expire at the end of 2021, it won't necessarily come to the Planning Commission, although I know we've had some discussion about whether or not we need language permanently for outdoor dining, if new restaurants are to open up or things like that. So but that's where that is at. And yes, I believe that's it.
Thanks, Nick. That was helpful. Any comments for Nick? Okay, last opportunity for commissioner comments. Agenda items, non-agenda items, anything at all. Do you have any other updates? I know Nikki talked about the broadband committees and subgroups a little bit. Anything additional to add there?
No, the subgroups have each picked a a reporter, if you will, that will be reporting back to the group of the whole as to what their work has been since the last time the whole group has met. I think things are starting to move along with that in terms of those groups getting their work done. Certainly a handful of individuals have shown a good amount of initiative, and you know, I don't want to speak on behalf of Jason, but based on his nod, I think he would agree with me that we're both impressed and appreciative of that. So excited to see what they can get done. And, you know, I think that broadband task force is getting some momentum.
Great. Do you know if the government affairs group has reached out now to our representatives? Have they done that yet?
I don't know if they have. To my memory, they've met once. They talked a little bit about that. Jason, you were there yesterday. I know Drew talked about that a little bit, about what they had worked on, but I don't know that she got into much detail.
She didn't.
Okay. Okay. I mean, the infrastructure package that's being talked about at the federal level, as you all know, includes a substantial money for broadband.
Mm-hmm.
And they keep talking about universal high-speed internet access. The dollars, you know, I don't know if the dollars they're proposing are nearly enough to do that, but it's something to watch, I think, right? So.
Yeah, it's definitely getting attention at the federal level, which is exciting. You know, we've certainly learned over the past year and change just how important internet is, especially internet that is even in terms of download and upload, you know, because that makes things like Zoom possible. So it's exciting to see that move forward, and we'll see what what that bill ends up looking like, and what the task force does as well.
Yep, it's a good time to do it though. So I think we're doing all this at a good time. Any other comments, commissioners? All right, well, we've got daylight left, so is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
I'll support it.
All right, support by Joel. All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Under an hour and a half. Good work, people. Good night.